Right. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you all are. Thank you very much for joining me for this webinar. My name's Ollie Kenchington, and I'm just going to be running through some colour management tips with you for shooting interviews and doing post-production on interviews. So the general idea is that I'm going to be talking for roughly 45 minutes or so. I've just got some slides that I'm going to be running through. They're mainly just prompts for me, I'm afraid, due to the sort of bandwidth and stuttering of video. It's actually easier just to have some stills up in a slideshow and just use those as prompts for me to talk through different areas that I'm going to talk about. So just bear with me whilst I'm chatting. Those of you who've been involved with any webinars or seen any talks that I've done before will know that I do like to talk and sometimes need to be reminded to shut up, but I'll do my best to be concise for you. So the general idea is that we're going to be attacking white balancing and exposure and color correction basics and everything sort of around the idea of shooting good quality interviews. So I run a production agency called Korro Films, and we're based in Somerset in the UK, and it's a particularly important part of our business, of our films. It's kind of the I don't know, the building blocks, I suppose, of our work. We work in corporates, in branded content, and any of you that work in a similar arena will know that where you have actors and scripts and dialogue driving narrative drama stuff, in our world, in the corporate and branded content world, it's all about the interview. The interview is our dialogue, it's our script, it's our story, it's the narration, if you like, that's driving the story forward in our work. And so for me, it's vital that we get really good quality interviews, and that means, you know, coming up with decent questions to ask them and making sure we get great sounding dialogue out of them, but also from a post point of view and a camera point of view, we need to make sure that they look fantastic, and that a big part of that is skin and skin tone. So Korro Films, as I say, specializes in these more kind of brand documentary area, I suppose. It's one of the kind of main cornerstones of our work, our calling card, if you like. We work with a lot of larger clients where they use us because of our focus on that story, that focus on being talked through, you know, whether it's a product or an experience or a brand or an event or whatever it might be. And so we need to make sure that we live up to our reputation for producing very good quality content in that area. Just separately, I also run Korro Academy, which is the sister company, which is a Blackmagic design certified training partner. So we work with Blackmagic Design in the UK to deliver certified color grading training using DaVinci Resolve, and it's my main profession. So as well as the creative director and owner of Korro Films, I'm also the lead colorist, if you like. Every single project that we work on is finished by myself. It's not always shot by me. We use an awful lot of freelancers. We have a huge amount of subcontractors that we pull in on jobs, but it is always me that's finishing them. I prize image quality very highly. It's, for me, an important tenet of our work, as I said, with the kind of customers that we work with, which include people like Apple. Apple are one of our clients. We've just shot something for them. In fact, we just delivered it today. Funnily enough, we shot it last week. It's just been delivered today. A relatively quick turnaround corporate internal comms piece for them, actually, which will never see the light of day outside of the halls of Apple, but is a short video just summarizing the launch of the world's largest Apple concession inside Harrods, which was opened last week. So when we're dealing with clients of that sort of size, it doesn't matter really how quick the turnaround is, we need to pull on our experience in terms of color management and expertise to make sure that we're producing really great quality content. And as a colorist, I'm obsessed with those pixels, the final image that's presented to our client. I'm sweating details that often clients won't even see, but it's part of who I am. I'm a perfectionist, and it makes me very disciplined in terms of production as well, and how we capture colors. So that's the kind of the main concerns of me and our business. But let's start nice and simply. I wanted to kick things off by talking about white balancing. It always surprises me how little the general sort of owner operator or small production company or freelancer actually thinks about white balancing. But when you consider that your entire color matrix is reorientated around the white point that you set when you white balance your camera, it means that literally every single color on that screen at the end is influenced by that central point, that white point that you select. So, hang on, sorry, slight technical interruption. Just bear with me 2 seconds. I've just realized that the chat is not working on my screen. I'm just going to quickly make sure that it is working. Otherwise, I won't be able to see if you guys are asking questions and such like. So when it comes to white balancing, obviously, we're talking about X-Rite products here, and this oh so important device comes with me absolutely everywhere. The color checker video target. The white balance side of that chart is always our first port of call when we're shooting interviews. In this slide, you can actually see me holding it. This was from a piece to camera that I was recording for one of our training series that we did last year for MZed.com. I believe this was directing color, which was our first one. We do genuinely use these constantly, and white balancing should be step one for any of you that are trying to get good color managed material that you can take with you through that post-production pipeline. As I said, what you're doing when you're white balancing your camera is you're orienting the entire color matrix to sit around the correct center point, the white point. I always liken it to spinning a plate. You know, when you see a circus and such like, people spinning plates on these little sticks. If your white point is set correctly, then that plate will balance. It will be completely flat and level as it spins around the center point. But if you have it unbalanced, if it's slightly off, then that plate would tip. It would fall towards the dominance of the color that you've accidentally set. And a lot of people rely on auto white balance. I'd be lying to you if I said I don't ever use auto white balance. It's there are certain situations, certain run and gun situations, or moments where you know that what you're going to get is going to be good enough. It's certainly with B-roll. I'm certainly not white balancing every single B-roll shot that we're off getting, but with interviews, there's no excuse. You've got all the time in the world, and if you don't feel like you have time with interviews, try and make time for it. Try and pre-warn clients or pre-warn your boss or whoever it is that you're shooting these interviews for that you need that time. Don't if you can possibly help it, don't let people rush you when it comes to these things. We allow a good 45 minutes to an hour to actually interview someone, and then a good 45 minutes to an hour for setup and prep. So it's some people will listen to that and think, God, I have 10 minutes to set up and shoot the whole thing. Those of you that are working at maybe a higher level might have even more time potentially, but no matter how much time you've got, you need to build it into your workflow. So when you're using these white balance cards, they make a huge difference, and it's such a simple step. It's almost there's almost no excuse for not doing it. The first question that I wanted to address, which is one that I get brought up an awful lot with this, is why should people bother using a proper white balance card? The color checker video here that we can see in this slide, this gray, it seems rather innocuous, like it's just a grey piece of card or whatever. It's actually a huge amount of effort goes into producing these cards, because it's actually technically incredibly difficult to produce a pigment-free paint. X-Rite you know, they own Pantone. Pantone you've probably heard of. Pantone is the standard in print and color management, and the expertise that come with that include the ability to print a precisely pigment-free surface. And the reason why that's so important is your camera will white balance from the light that bounces off of this and then comes into the camera through the lens. So the light that bounces off this surface, if there are pigments in that surface, it will absorb those frequencies of the light, and then the reflected light is missing certain parts of the frequency of the spectrum. So your camera is then being told to white balance from something that's missing data. And as you can probably understand, with anything, if you're taking a sample from something and there's data missing, you're going to get incorrect conclusions from that, and the camera will come up with an incorrect white balance if it's missing certain frequencies. So using a white piece of paper or a white wall or you know, anything like that is going to have pigments in it. You may not be able to see them because your eyes are not particularly good at seeing those pigments, but it doesn't mean that they're not there. And it also doesn't mean that your camera won't be able to pick up on that, because camera sensors are incredibly sensitive to those color variations. So a pigment-free surface is vital for this. Another thing that I get asked is, why are they grey? It seems quite a silly thing that this is a white balance card, but it's not white itself. There's a good reason for that, and understanding why it's there can help you avoid errors creeping in. So one of the reasons why this is grey is because all camera sensors are optimized to record the most amount of information in the middle grey part of the sensor. It's where human skin falls. It's where the midpoint, the mid-grey reference for your gamma sits. And so there's a lot of useful information that's recorded in a huge amount of detail by the camera. So you get a richer sort of sample, if you like, from that grey part of the image. However, you also want something that's close enough in tonality to the higher end. So you'll notice it's a light grey here. The reason why it's not white is because it's very easy with a white surface to slightly overexpose it, or massively overexpose it, but it's harder to differentiate between a slightly overexposed white and an exposed white. If and sometimes it can be even more tricky because it might just be one channel. So if your white balance is obviously wrong before you white balance and you're trying to point it at this chart, it might be that it looks like you can see the chart clearly, but it might be that, say, your red channel is actually slightly clipped. Again, if one of your color channels is clipped, then you're missing data. And if you're missing data, you can't get a sensible conclusion from it. So not being white reduces the chances of a channel being clipped. It pushes the sample area down to closer to the sweet spot of the grays where your midtones fall. And those are the reasons why you should invest in these proper pigment-free cards and use them for your white balancing. So assuming you've manually white balanced your camera and you've reoriented the color matrix around the correct white point for your environment, what do you do when you have to deal with mixed light scenarios? It's again often the reality for people that they don't have complete control over the ambient light creeping in, for example. This still is actually of a space that we filmed in. That previous slide was the piece to camera that was from was actually recorded in this space, this room here. So as you can see with the windows there, pretty hard to avoid ambient light spilling into that situation. So when I talk about mixed lighting, people I think often just assume you mean, oh, there's some artificial lights turned on somewhere. Mixed lighting to me means any two color temperatures or more that are in your scene. And so that mixing will obviously cause problems where our eyes adapt and can deal with the subtle changes of color temperature from area to area. Our cameras aren't quite so good, and you can very easily end up in a scenario where a tint is introduced into part of the frame, or worst of all into skin tones, because there's a mixture of color temperatures entering the space. One of the worst offenders is sort of office fluorescent lights. Those fluorescent tubes produce light by sending electrical current through a metal filament in a gas, and it's a very cheap way of producing bright light, but it's not a very color accurate way, and they actually give off a very nasty green tint, like a limey, yellowy green tint that just looks awful in skin. There's nothing worse than a green or a yellowy green in skin, because we associate it with death and we associate it with sickness. And I don't know about you, but if I'm filming some CEO or some talent for a project, the last thing that I think the client wants is for me to make them look like they're dead or ill. So obviously, if we can avoid those green tints entering skin, then we should, all things being equal. So those types of light sources are very tricky to handle. In fact, it's so difficult to get color accurate fluorescence. There's only one company that ever managed it, and they very quickly patented it. And you may have heard of Kinoflow and their fluorescent tubes. They're literally the only people on the planet that have the patented technology to accurately render white light from that type of fluorescent tube technology. So unless you happen to walk into an office where they've invested in Kinoflow lamps in the ceiling, which I doubt very much, you are going to want to deal with that in some way, and the most obvious way is to turn them off. It does surprise me again how few people think of doing that. I remember once I outsourced a shoot to a camera operator who had a huge amount of experience, and I had a huge amount of respect for him, and he always produced great stuff for me. But this stuff came back, and there was some interviews that he shot, and there was this green tint in the skin tones, and I contacted him and said, I don't understand how has this happened. It looks like there's some fluorescent lights on somewhere. And he said, oh yeah, no, it's quite dark. I only brought one light with me. It wasn't quite bright enough, so I decided to leave the overheads on. It just goes to show you sometimes you think you can get away with it, and I think our eyes trick us because our eyes don't see this tint, and we think, oh, it can't be that bad. But trust me, it really is, and you should turn them off and find any other mechanism for introducing light that you can possibly attempt to avoid those nasty green tints. Green's a recurring theme, actually. Green is an inherent weakness in LEDs as well. So certainly cheaper LED fixtures tend to struggle with the inherent green tint you get from LEDs. And another problem that you often find is sometimes LED manufacturers will try and overcompensate for that. So they'll introduce magenta filters in the instrument itself to try and counteract that green. Magenta sits opposite green on the color wheel, so yeah, if you introduce magenta, it in theory will cancel out that green. But I've worked with lights where that over time that filtering gets too strong, so you actually end up going the other way, and you end up with quite pink looking lights. I guess the moral of the story is, if you've got a light source like that, an artificial light source like a fluorescent, you should turn it off. But if you're working with LEDs, particularly cheaper LEDs, you should also be mindful of the fact that that light source might be introducing a color tint that you can't see. And this feeds back to the white balancing thing I was just talking about. When you manually white balance a camera, so I don't mean setting your camera to manual input, which is where you dial in a Kelvin number specifically. I'm talking about manually white balancing into a preset A or B slot, pressing the sample button, it flashing at you, and then recording the white balance that it's picking up off your gray card. When you do that, almost all cameras, not only will they set the white point based on that sort of Kelvin axis, which if you like is a blue-yellow axis, they will also use the sensor's reading to introduce a color corrective process as well. So I know, for example, on the Canon cameras I use, you'll see the white balance reading after you've manually white balanced in Kelvin, but then you will also see a CC number, which is a color correction number, which will be a plus or minus, which is it introducing green or magenta into the color matrix to counteract any green or magenta that it's detecting off your white balance card. So again, making sure you manually white balance is a very simple way of making sure that your camera accounts for the any kind of tints that you might have in any artificial light sources. So mitigating those nasty sort of sources is quite a simple thing of turning it off, making sure you manually white balance. When it comes to natural light, there's a few things that you can do. If you're in a situation where you can't avoid natural light coming into your scene, if you're shooting for a short period, that should be fine. If it's completely cloudless, and it doesn't look like there's any clouds nearby or a chance of them coming over, you should be fine. Likewise, if it's very thick cloud cover and it doesn't look like that's going to pass anytime soon, you should be pretty fine. But you will see constant subtle changes in color temperature with daylight. It's permanently varying as cloud thickness gets changes, gets thicker and thinner. You'll see it getting warmer and cooler over time, and sometimes the changes can be quite stark. So it is tricky working with natural light. But one of the easiest mistakes to avoid, which I see time and time again, is people walking into environments where there's natural light coming in. They can't shut it out, or they don't want to shut it out, and they will just turn their artificial lights on, and they will just set them to 5,500 or 5,600 Kelvin. So the space that you see here, there's lots of windows here, we obviously couldn't fight that. If you walk into a space like this and just turn on any artificial lights you've brought with you and set them to 5,600 or whatever the daylight mode is on that light fixture, you are almost certainly going to be instantly introducing a mixed color temperature, because daylight isn't 5,500 Kelvin or 5,600 Kelvin. It is sometimes, but it isn't always. Color temperature of daylight changes permanently. So how can a daylight fixture be set to a precise Kelvin and always be that? Well, the reason is because they can't make it vary. They have to choose something, and what they do is they pin daylight on an average. And in fact, the average can also be misleading, because the average that you get with daylight fixtures of 5,500 Kelvin is in fact the average in Los Angeles, where obviously Hollywood is, and the light manufacturers had to pin daylight to something, and they went with the average white point, the average daylight temperature in their biggest market in Hollywood. If you need a good example of this, the broadcast white point for television, the standards for which were set in Northern Europe, the white point is 6,500. So 6,500, 1,000 Kelvin different, that's the average daylight color temperature in Northern Europe. So if you're shooting in the UK like I am, you know, that's more likely you're going to be closer to that. We have thicker cloud cover, more regularly, have overcast days. You might find it's 5,500 Kelvin if it's July in the UK and it's a midday sun and there's no clouds, but you can't just assume that it is. So all you have to do in that situation is, if you're working with a bi-colored light, so a light that you can adjust the color temperature of, is take a manual white balance reading with your lights off, so that you can sample the ambient light around you, find out what it is, and then dial that same Kelvin into your light fixture. You're then avoiding any mixed color temperatures. It's a very simple step, but it makes a big difference. Yes, that daylight will change, but as I said, if you try and time it when there's a consistency of weather, then you should find for a good 15, 20 minutes or so, if you're shooting a relatively quick-ish interview, you should be all right. But it is often surprising, I think, that people just assume that daylight is actually 5,500 Kelvin, and they don't think to measure the actual color temperature of the light that's coming in, and then think to match their lights to it. Obviously, if you don't have a bicolor or a variable color light, artificial light, then you can't do that, but you can use gels. You can do it the traditional way if you needed to. So there's a couple of tips there just for best practice when you're in a mixed light environment. This is just a slide of me using one of our lights. This is the light panel Gemini, dialing in a Kelvin here. What's good about this particular light, in fact, is that it goes up to 10,000 Kelvin. So you might think, oh, why would you ever need that? I've shot in environments where there's natural light coming in through a window that we can't get rid of, and that natural light is in fact sunlight on a north-facing wall that's bouncing off a number of other buildings and then eventually coming in, and it's very, very cool. And until you actually measure the color temperature of daylight on multiple occasions, you don't start to realize just how cool it is. And there was a situation we had recently where we were shooting, and we measured the ambient daylight coming in. That was very diffuse, so it bounced off several other buildings before it came into our window, and it was 8,000 Kelvin. So if we had just plumbed our lights in at 5.6, you would have had a massive discrepancy between those two color temperatures. But having a light source that you can dial in a color temperature that goes beyond 5.6 is a very useful thing. As I say, this is the Gemini, this is the new 1x1, goes up to 10,000 Kelvin. That gives me a huge amount of flexibility in those kind of situations. So let's move on to exposure. Again, I'm going to split it into two halves, just some basic pointers and then some more advanced stuff to help you out. So the first things to talk about with sort of basic exposure is using simple tools to help you. The last thing you should be doing is eyeballing it. You shouldn't just be staring at your camera's monitor and saying that looks about right. Again, when you're shooting an interview, you've got that time. So you know, in this slide, you see me using the color chart side of the color checker video. You can just about see on the right hand side of this slide, we've got the Atomos Sumo 19M, our production monitor that we've got on set with us. We can see the waveforms there, and we're using the waveform monitor there to plot our exposure. One of the simple ways of doing this is you can do it. There's four main exposure chips in the middle there. There's the white one at the top, the light gray, dark gray, and black. For me personally, the one I prefer to use is the 90% reflectance chip at the top. Mainly that's because it's the easiest to see in the waveform because it sits elevated above all the rest of those ones. You can actually see, if you look very closely, there's a line across the middle of the waveform there, which is our 90% line. All the other thing that I find is that most camera manufacturers, when they produce their white papers that show how to expose with their different curves, their different gamma curves, 90% reflectance is a standard reference point, the other one being 18% gray. So those are the two standard data code values that are shown, and where they start in a Rec 709 curve and where they go in a log curve, for example. Those are the standard format that you see. So it's often very easy just to, you know, say you're shooting with a Sony and you've not shot with it before, and you're shooting, you need to shoot an S-Log2, and you don't know where that white point should go. If you look at the white paper for S-Log2, it will show you a very simple little box that shows 90% reflectance and where it goes. In fact, with S-Log2 it goes to 59 IRE. So if you know those values, you can plot them exactly. And a very good tip here, by the way, is if you don't know where 90% reflectance drops to, if you're not like me and spend your evenings and weekends reading white papers, then a very simple technique is just to set your camera to Rec 709 or standard gamma initially. And then when you're in a standard Rec 709 curve, that 90% reflectance is very easy to remember. It should be at 90 IRE on your waveform monitor. You can then, once you've set your exposure like that, you can then go into the menu and set your gamma curve to be whatever you want it to be, whether it's log or a hyper gamma or a YDR or whatever it might be. Because you change the gamma after you've exposed, it will maintain your exposure. So your exposure should be correct. Now, I know with certain cameras, I won't name names, but with certain cameras, you're recommended to overexpose the image above where normal exposure would sit, to deal with an elevated noise floor, so to clean up noise. But if you're shooting with a camera that doesn't have those problems, then you will find that you can just expose in standard Rec 709, 90% reflectance hits 90 IRE. Then you can change your gamma and the exposure will still be correct, and you don't need to remember where 90% drops to. It's quite a simple technique anyway. Now, I tend to use waveforms. I like the fact that I can place where objects fall left to right in the frame, but there's no reason why you couldn't use histograms. If your camera only has a histogram, you should see a little spike around about 90 along the x-axis of a histogram. Zebras is another classic one. You can turn on zebras in your camera. Most cameras have the ability to choose Zebra 1 or Zebra 2. You should be choosing Zebra 2 if you're doing this technique. Zebra 1 is a range, whereas we don't want a plus minus 5% range. We want a specific value. So if you use Zebra 2, you can set a specific value and it will only come on at that point and it will stay on. The little lines on the screen will stay on. So if you set your Zebra 2 to 90%, and then point your camera at the chart, as soon as you see the little zebra lines appear on that 90% chip at the top, then you know you're exposed. It's a great way for getting consistency as well with other cameras. It's all based around Rec 709. So if you have a scene that's extending in terms of dynamic range above Rec 709, then if you expose like this, you may well clip highlights that go beyond the reach of SDR. With time and with some sort of honing your gut instincts. You get good at knowing when that's going to be a problem, and knowing to kind of just resort to a sort of a standard expose to the right or protect highlights kind of workflow. For any situation where your dynamic range sits nicely within that sort of 10 stop Rec 709 range, this works flawlessly. The other one I'll just mention quickly is false color. False color is another great way. I don't have the slide, unfortunately, but there is a false color mode on most external monitors, certainly on all our Atomos monitors, and that can be a very useful way to just point the camera at the chart, and when the middle gray is still gray, which is where most of the 50% parts appear in false color scopes, then you know that you're exposed correctly that way as well. So there's a couple of sort of basic techniques there to help you with your exposure. The other thing I wanted to talk about is specifically exposing for skin. I mentioned just now about log curves. So that if anyone's listening and they're not familiar with shooting log, shooting with a logarithmic gamma curve enables you to capture a wider dynamic range, but still hold it within the same excuse me, the same size codec that you're shooting with. So it's essentially a compression technique. A lot of people don't think of it that way, but that is really what it's doing. It's actually compressing your dynamic range so that it fits into a smaller container. As with any type of compression, there are consequences to that. There are often negative consequences to compressing, and I think anyone who thinks that shooting log is a panacea, it's a cure-all, it's you know, I hear people constantly saying to me, oh, I shoot everything log, like it's a really good thing. You should only choose to shoot log if you have a scene with the dynamic range that demands it, or if you've got a nice clean camera that can retain a lot of useful data across the whole, you know, the dynamic range, the number of stops that log enables you to capture. If you're shooting, you know, let's say, you know, again, I'm a Canon person, so if I think of Canon Log 2, Canon Log 2 is designed for capturing 15 stops of dynamic range. Well, there's two things about that. If my scene doesn't have 15 stops of dynamic range, what's the point? And if my scene has 15 stops of dynamic range, but I'm using a camera whose sensor isn't very good at producing clean, useful information in shadows and highlights, then I've got 15 stops, but the bottom two and top two are useless because there's no data in them. There's no point. So I think it's far more complicated than just thinking I'm always going to shoot log. You've got to think about the scene, but provided you've got a decent camera that can resolve a good amount of dynamic range on the sensor, and you're in a scene with a good amount of dynamic range for that sensor to capture, then log is a perfectly decent choice. One of the big problems with it, though, is obviously it's shifting around your spread of contrast. Your camera sensors work natively work linearly, so they plot black to white in a completely linear fashion. So we're using these power functions, these gamma adjustments in the camera to redistribute that, realign those black to white points, and that's great. That helps us capture information, greater dynamic range. It helps us mimic more closely the way that our eyes work. That's all great, but it's moving reference points around. So for example, as I just said, 90% reflectance moves somewhere else. It normally moves to around about 60% in most log curves. So you need to be careful about how you expose your subject, because if, like here, we've got, you know, a human being, or I believe I'm human, my skin should fall in a very specific place. And the danger that you'll find is if you overexpose skin with a log curve, is you can end up pushing that skin into the most compressed part of that curve. So if I show you a simple comparison between these aren't technically accurate, these are rough, just so you know, don't pin don't take a screenshot and then say, well, this is what Ollie said all log curves look like. Just as a generic example here, we have the Rec 709 curve and a log curve next to it. You can see there's middle gray in the middle there, by the way. So you can see as we extend above middle gray in our log curve, we're pulling down, we're bringing down so much extra information at the top. It is, you know, as I say, a type of compression, if you like. If you overexpose with a log curve, you'll end up pushing skin tones, which should be in that middle gray area, you're pushing them up into the more highly compressed part of the gamma curve, which are reserved for brighter highlights. One of the major consequences of that, and some cameras are better than others, but one of the classic problems that you get if you do that is you end up with skin looking plasticky and kind of artificial, like they're sort of a mannequin or something, or a lack of color tonality as well as another problem. And that's because skin shouldn't be up in that part of the compression curve for log. It should be still in that kind of middle gray kind of area. It's not as hard as you might think, because if you look at these two curves, where they intersect at middle grey, they're very similar. The deviation between log and a Rec 7/9 curve is most pronounced in the highlights at the top and a little bit at the bottom in the shadows, but in the middle, they're all roughly in the same area. And there's a reason for that, because most of the world lives in that area, particularly skin tones exist in that area. So the idea is that you shouldn't, even if you're shooting log, the curve should be trying to avoid messing with that key part of your contrast and doing most of its work at that higher end. So if you're overexposing, the camera doesn't know that. The camera's doesn't realize that, you know, maybe you're overexposing by 2 stops because your camera's quite noisy. And so you're pushing your skin tones into an area where they really shouldn't be, and they're going to start to look really plasticky. So again, choose wisely, expose carefully, and if you find that when you're exposing for your skin correctly, that your image is noisy, then you know that's a problem with your camera. That's not because you've done something wrong. It means you probably need to bring in and introduce more ambient light to bring the noise floor up, to lower your dynamic range of your scene. You know, bring in a reflector, bring in some extra lights, try and bring that shadow point up to try and clean it up that way if you can. But certainly don't use log as an excuse to forget about lighting. That's a rather silly approach to using log, if you ask me. Yes, exposing log correctly is about, as I said, a very simple tip is just simply expose your camera using the chart while still in Rec 7 and 9 mode, and then change your camera afterwards. That's a very effective way of making sure that your key parts of your scene end up in the right place. Right. Let's just do a little thing about post. So that's all kind of stuff that we can do in camera to try and make sure that we're capturing good looking interviews. And of course, the X-Rite color checker video target is fantastically useful in those production stages, but it's also vitally important to capture that chart and bring it with us into post-production. So I'm going to start off just using a quick little demonstration with an interview in DaVinci Resolve. So I'm actually going to come out of my slideshow for a second, and hopefully you can all see my DaVinci Resolve interface here. So what I've got here is, this is actually an interview. This is a shot from our Mastering Color course that we did for MZed last year, and this is one of the interviews in that course. It's like a 7.5-hour course. There's quite a few different interviews, but this is just one that I happen to still have the media on my drive when I was prepping earlier today. So you can see, as with all our interviews, we have this is Philip Bloom here, who kindly did an interview for our series. We've got him, like everyone else who we interview, holding the chart, capturing that. I'm just going to quickly show you how I would use that information to pull this down. Now, obviously, you can use LUTs, technical LUTs to correct from a gamma, a log gamma to normalize it into Rec 709. As I just said, if you have deviated slightly from ideal exposure, then that LUT's not going to realize that, and that LUT's going to essentially end up producing a wrong image that you'll take time to then correct that out, and by which time you probably could have just done it manually from the start. Certainly color transforms are very useful, but I find the cheaper the cameras you're using, or the lesser your level of experience, certainly if you're white balancing wrong and exposing wrong, by the time you've actually put on a color space transformer or a technical LUT to transform your color space or your gamma, you know, if you fed in such wrong information, then the stuff you get out is so wrong that you end up wasting time trying to fix it. So there is a very simple technique that you can use to correct just manually from scratch. So very quickly, just going to show you that. So I'm just going to start off by setting my white and black point. I'm just going to isolate the white to black chips in the middle of my screen here. Let's just turn this into a Y only. And I'm just going to hide. So I'm just using the highlight mode just to hide this, and I can see in my waveform in the bottom right corner now, it's nice and clear and easy for me to see where my different reference charts point. So if I pull black down to just above 0, if I place my white, so I'm just normalizing this back to essentially a Rec 709 starting point. It's going to do it very roughly because I haven't got time for anything else because I'm already behind schedule. If I just turn that off there, hang on, let me turn this back on. That black is a bit too high. Let's pull that back there. Get my white back up. It's a bit push and pull. We're approaching something like normal contrast there. The other thing I can do is I can correct out my, let's just push a little bit faster on that. I can push my colors in as well. So if I turn this back on and move it across to my color references here, so not only are we getting help in terms of contrast, but we're also getting useful information. So if I use my vector scope, what I can do is I can plot where these are. So if you look in my, let me brighten this up so you can see it a bit more clearly. If you look in the vector scope, you can see these lines. These are the chromaticity coordinates for primary red, green, blue, and secondary yellow, magenta, and cyan in Rec 709 color space. That's what these chips align with. This is why you should always use a video target and not the Color Checker Classic. The Color Checker Classics are primary and secondary color chips are not based on Rec 709 video standards. They're based on photography standards, so they don't actually align, and you'll get incorrect results if you don't use the correct one. So let me first of all just push in an arbitrary amount of saturation just to get these a bit closer to their boxes, and then I'm just going to use these tools here just to orientate. And you can see I'm just moving very broadly, just moving the hues round so that they're pointing towards the correct values. If they're off, then basically those colors are incorrect, which obviously would be a bad thing. You can see that green is often quite weak, green and cyan. This is just part of the debayering process. It's often quite tricky. If I get that roughly in the right place, let me come back in here and just reset the image. So you can see there we've just gone from a log image to a technically color accurate. Phil's skin tones now should be pretty accurate because I'm manually white balanced, and I've just corrected out any subtle deviation in the actual camera's color science from where the ideal red, green, blue, and secondary references appear. So by doing that, I'm giving myself a really strong starting point, and it's a good basic corrector. And what I actually often do, and I did do for all of these interviews in the Mastering Color series, is I simply right-clicked and generated a 3D LUT from that and brought that into my editing package. I use Final Cut Pro 10 and just applied that as a LUT, a manually created LUT inside the edit package, and we just cut from there. And when I was done, I just round trip the whole thing back across to Resolve to do any kind of finishing continuity and finish the grade off. Once I've taken that information, I can actually just copy that information. So I can copy that node, and I can just paste that across. Let's turn this off. I can paste that across to the actual interview. So I've got the actual interview here. Again, you can see there's the log image and there's the balanced image. In terms of basic color correction, tackling that contrast, tackling that color balance, correctly placing those color primaries and secondaries based on Rec 709, that for me is my kind of basic corrective steps that I would go through. But what I want to, do I really need to go back to my slide to do this? I suppose I should probably go back to my slide just to show the next color balancing skin tones. Okay, so skin tones are, they're a memory color. They're something that we all instantly recognize, ingrained into our psyche because it's part of our evolution, our biology, to recognize these colors: sky, foliage, skin. They're all memory colors, and so getting them wrong is the most heinous crime you can commit, unless of course you're doing it deliberately, which is absolutely fine as long as you say you're doing it deliberately. But color balancing skin is a tricky thing because, well, first of all, what is the color of skin? What is it, and is there an ideal thing? Is there such a thing as a perfect skin tone? I think that latter question is there's definitely certain flavors. There's certain fads that you go through. I talked to an incredible makeup artist called Peter Swords King in our Mastering Color series. That he's an Oscar-winning, Academy Award-winning makeup artist. He's worked on countless films, and he said he's been working in that industry for such a long time. He said it's really interesting seeing changes in sort of fashion. So from very tanned looking skin that's now slowly actually going a bit more out of fashion and getting back more to sort of paler, more pinky looking skin rather than more sort of yellowy tan skin. There is no perfect skin tone, but there is certainly fashionable skin tones. And I guess the thing that if you look at most content and most skin tones that you want, like most things, we're creating with film, we're creating an idealized version of reality. And I think skin is part and parcel of that. And in an ideal world, my complexion would always be flawless and consistent across my face. But actually, if I come out of the gym, then normally for a good couple of hours afterwards, I have a very pink forehead and cheeks. And there's quite a big discrepancy in the tones and the colors across my face. What we have the ability to do, in the same way that a photographer would when they're retouching photos as well, or an artist would, is we have that ability to refine our skin tones and create a kind of an ideal, if you like. So what I've actually done here, if I come back to this shot with Phil, I've got a couple of little things that I've done to help me let's turn this off, to help me kind of deal with create a more consistent skin tone, if you like, a more idealized version of reality. And I'm just going to show you that technique. So I'm actually going to remove or reset part of this. So one of the things that I've done here is I've helped to create more uniformity across the skin here. And this isn't, this isn't because Philip Bloom's got weird skin. He's got perfectly normal skin like everyone else. But I find that this is a step that I can employ quite frequently with skin tones, just to create a more uniform sort of idealized look, if you like. So what I'm actually using here is a built-in effect, an open effect inside DaVinci Resolve, which is called the color compressor. The color compressor is part of the Resolve Effects color. I believe it's actually one of the ones that you only get in the studio version of Resolve. So if you have the free version, you wouldn't necessarily have this. It's an incredibly useful tool because what it allows me to do is to select a target color. So if I let's do something silly like click on the blue background there, I can click on a target color and I can compress the colors in my shot to match that. Now, if you look at the vector scope down here, what it's doing is I've just clicked on a blue. Blue is down here in the vector scope. As I compress, you can see it's pulling any colors that are falling one side or the other. It's pulling them around and making them the color I just clicked on. So I clicked on blue. Now his face has gone blue when it's on full. Obviously, I don't want to make his face blue. What I can do is I could click on the sample and I could click on maybe a part of his skin that is the ideal. So there's quite a little bit of pinkiness on his nose there and on his forehead, so let's maybe click on the sort of yellower parts. You tend to get more yellow skin tones along the edges of the face and certainly around the neck where the veins are further back. So you're left with more of the yellow kind of melanin colors, and where the capillaries are closer to the surface of the skin, around cheeks and noses and foreheads and lips, you get more red coming through from the hemoglobin from the blood. But let's say that I wanted a bit more consistency. Let's click on this more yellow part of his skin here, and if I put that on full, obviously it's doing terrible things to the background, but you should be able to see there, but it's actually pulling in those other colors in his face to create more consistency. So one of the things that you can do with the chart, if I just go back to the chart, you'll notice that we have our skin tones listed along the side here. So Phil's skin looks, because I've manually white balanced, the skin looks perfectly acceptable in this shot, and I could just sample from a part of his skin which already looks good and pull the others around if I wanted to. But if you had particularly bad skin, or there was someone who was particularly red, I've interviewed kind of people before where they're they are quite just naturally pink faced, they maybe they're slightly overweight and their circulation isn't quite good, and you get people with very pink faces. The nice thing about this is it doesn't matter how good or bad or otherwise their their skin is, you can actually take a sample from here, which are good cross references for a sort of a sample of range of skin colors, which will all be the same rough hue, because all skin, as I said, is made up of the color of melanin and heat of blood, and so it's consistent across all races. It doesn't matter what skin color you've got in terms of race or ethnicity. It's a consistent color. So what's nice about these references is I can actually plumb those references in and take it. So if I have that shot, I can take it from there. What I quite like doing is with this shot open, applying the color compressor, and then opening up the target color box. Instead of using the sampler, using the target color box. And in Mac OS, you can preset and save little color swatches. So I've actually taken samples of all of the different skin color swatches on the color chart, and I've actually saved them by simply, clicking, selecting, and then dragging it across. I've actually saved them along here. So what I can do is I can choose the one that's most closely matching to his general skin tone, which actually I think is probably this one here. Click OK. That loads that into the target color swatch, and then I can start to refine that color. Why? I think I might have accidentally screwed up my skin selection at some point when I was talking to you, and that's probably why I'm changing the background at the same time. There we go. Let's turn that back off. So it's very difficult for you to see this because his skin already looks quite good. If I just zoom in a little bit, as I compress the hue, you should be able to see that pinkiness that we're just getting around under the eyes, eyelids, around the nose, we're just pulling that round. If I put it on full, it's too much. His lips end up going as well. And I could hold that out with a little mask. That's not too much of a problem, but I can actually just pull out just a little bit, and it actually creates a bit more continuity, slightly less pinkiness in those areas. I can also do the same with the saturation. So I can just pull up the saturation again, just to stop any kind of like, if someone's got, not that it's the case here, but if someone's got, very strong like fake tan on, or has just come back from holiday, or they've got very saturated skin, then this can be very useful for just pulling away some of that saturation. In this case, it's easy to do too much, so I'm just going to pull off just a little bit of saturation, saturation there. This wouldn't be useful for skin with these references, but there's also a compressed luminance option here, which wouldn't be useful here. And there's also a global blend, so I can pull back and forth from where I was and where I'm going. If I just zoom back from that, that's creating more continuity. If I just turn that off and on, you can see that's just creating a little bit more uniformity across his skin. And then the last thing I've done here is I've actually boosted the saturation. If I just show here, I've just used a hue versus sat just to boost the blues in his jacket, enhancing the wardrobe and location choices we made, using blue and its naturally falling opposite skin. You can see that nice balance, a sort of classic secondary color balance that we've got there. But I'm just boosting up that blue saturation so that it's more balanced. You can see the skin's quite saturated, blue isn't very saturated, and I'm just pulling that blue across. It's a bit more balanced and creates just a nice final kind of look, if you like. This is a very accurate and technically kind of ideal, if you like, look. But I could then, if I wanted to, I could then always add a kind of a look in a final node at the end, kind of, maybe make it very crunchy and contrasty, and pull the colors around or whatever I wanted to do. I can always do that final kind of creative look if I need one in a final node, once all of the underpinnings and all the good kind of neutralization and idealized image stuff is done underneath if I want. But actually, most of the time, I just want to have it look as good as possible. So that's where I'm going to end up with that. Okay, let me come back in here, and then we're going to do a quick Q&A. So just to summarize, basically, if you get these things right, they're simple things. And the thing I love most about the Color Checker product is that it's low tech. I'm sat in my studio at the moment. I'm surrounded by tens of thousands of pounds worth of video equipment, and it's the Color Checker video target that goes with me everywhere. It's so low tech, relatively inexpensive compared to all the other kit I've got here. I like that it's a simple, low tech, no nonsense solution to major potential issues that might afflict certain people in terms of the look and finish of your final image, and particularly with where skin tones are concerned. It's because, just one last thing, just to toot my own horn, I do strongly believe that you know, we're a very small agency in the UK, but we, as I say, we include people like Apple amongst our clients. We've recently been shortlisted for a Brand Film Festival London award in the brand documentary category. We're going up against the other 11 people that we've been shortlisted with are massive production agencies who have produced brand documentary films for people like Facebook, Carlsberg, Arsenal Football Club, Google. There's Volvo, Jaguar, Land Rover. They're all huge production agencies and huge clients, and there's us. You know, this film here is that we've been selected for was a simple promotional documentary style promotional film that we did with a budget of less than £5,000 for a local client of ours, and we're sitting amongst these huge production agencies with huge clients, shortlisted for a brand film festival award. And I strongly believe that the reason why we punch above our weight in that way is because we do sweat these details about color balance, about color management, and we use these techniques in everything that we do to make sure that we're producing just the best images that we can. And I hope that you've learnt a few tips in here to help you up your game and produce better looking content going forwards as well. So thank you very much for listening, and let me just come back and see if there are any questions. Alex, have you got anything for me? Have I? It's very quiet in here. Any questions? No questions. Okay, I'm going to give you all a couple of minutes to think. I'm assuming there are no questions because you were all listening intently. So now's your opportunity to type those questions in. You should be able to add them into the questions field or the chat field, however it appears on the screen there. You should be able to enter any questions, which will pop up on my screen, and I will do my best to answer them for you. Apparently everything was really well explained, and that's why there are no questions. Okay, I'm down with that. Well, what I will say then is, in fact, I'll type this on my screen so it's easier for you to see. There is on Facebook, there is a closed group called Korro Alumni, spelt like that. Let me just put this on screen. Excuse me. So you can see it. So Korro Alumni. If you do have any questions or anything occurs to you after this event closes, this webinar closes, I would urge you to send a request to join that closed group, that Korro Alumni group. It's got hundreds of people in there. It's a place for anyone that I've presented to, like with webinars or events or training courses that we've done, a place for people to ask questions. You can post work in there, and we will, you know, I will critique it if you want some feedback on work that you've been doing, color grading or anything really. Questions. Everyone in that group has been through my training courses, and I monitor it very closely, so you should get pretty good answers. I remember a time quite recently, I'm a member of the Canon C200 user group or owner user group on Facebook, and someone posted a question, a very basic question: what's the native ISO of the Canon C200? And when I went to answer it, I could see that there'd already been like 30 or 40 people posting their answers in there, and I say a good 90% of those responses were the incorrect answer. And I wrote down my answer, the correct answer, but of course in a sea of 40 odd responses, most of which say one thing, and then there's a couple that say the other, then obviously that poor person would have gone away assuming it must be the other. So what's quite useful about Korro Alumni's closed group on Facebook is that you will get the right answer, or at least we damn well hope that you get the right answer. Well, if there really are no questions, I will love you and leave you. It's been a pleasure talking to you on this fine spring evening here in the UK, wherever you are. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and until next time, thank you very much for tuning in.